What's up, everyone? Welcome into the Dear Miss Fantasy Show. Tara Roberts here, the official mailbag show for Player Profiler. And today is, it's not the Dear Miss Fantasy show. It is the Stefon Diggs, the Houston show. That is the main focus of this show. I hope that you're not tired of it because I got a ton to cover. We're going to talk about Stefon Diggs and his performance. We're going to dive into what this means for Buffalo. And spoiler alert, my opinion is probably contrary to what you might be thinking. I've got some interesting insights to how Buffalo is going to move forward and whether that their window is close. So, stick around. It's going to be kind of interesting on that one. And then obviously we're going to talk about how this benefits Houston because obviously this is a big benefit. This is a big deal. Houston making the money move. So it's going to be fun. Before I dive into it, this show was planned last minute. Stefon Diggs inspired me because I've been craving football content, right? There's plenty to talk about, right? There's sleepers, there's draft stuff, there's all kinds of rumors, but I've been craving a big football drama, big football news, something, and leave it to Stefon Diggs to give it to us. If you can count on him for anything, he's going to deliver in entertainment value. So I appreciate Stefon Diggs for that. Thank you, Stefon Diggs, for giving me something to do. So it was planned last minute because life has been life. I was going to pick up next week and, kick things off with some pre-draft goodness because we're getting super close to that. So exciting. But I have been sick. My entire family has been sick for the past 2 weeks. It's just been running through the house. And on top of that, I think I posted it in a picture on Twitter where you could kind of see it at some point. But I burst a blood vessel in one of my eyes, and it was actually pretty bad. Half the eye was just completely red. Oddly painful. It's not supposed to be painful. Kind of worried there, but it turned out okay. So I can see I'm good to go. But yeah, that kind of sucked. Kind of put me out of commission. I didn't make videos for a while there because I looked kind of crazy. But we are back in action here. We're going to dive right into it. I thought I would start us off with the good stuff. We'll talk about the fantasy implications and everything in a second, but I wanted to start off with the big question because we are the mailbag show, right? We got to ask a question. So what's the big question that is on everyone's mind? The big question that everyone is asking and debating? It's the is Stefon Diggs cooked question, right? Everyone is looking at his performances in the back half of the past 2 seasons, and they're looking at his age and they're saying, okay, are we really going to see Stefon Diggs be Stefon Diggs again? Is this just the end? Is he heading to Houston to be the wide receiver 3? Were they booting him out because they really don't see the value in him in Buffalo anymore? And there's a lot of different ways that we can look at this. Wide receivers in general it's kind of tough to tell with them. There's obvious, drop-offs, right? When a guy reaches a certain point and you say, okay, he's no longer the receiver that he was. But wide receivers, sometimes you get into that little gray area where there's things that kind of factor into why they could or could not be struggling. We had Keenan Allen, right? Who dealt with the injury, had a down season, came back and was fantastic while Justin Herbert was playing last year. So with wide receivers, you get up in age, it's kind of more difficult to tell. It's super easy to tell when a running back is cooked, right? You can look at a running back and say, okay, you had a dramatic dip in carries, a dramatic dip in touchdowns, a dramatic dip in, your yards per carry dipped by a full yard, right? We can tell, okay? Unfortunately, you might be a little cooked. You might be transitioning to that different portion of your career now. But with wide receivers, you can actually make excuses for them, right? I know Devontae Adams is old. I know he had a bad year, but I also know that his team and his quarterback situation was a big contributing factor there. So I can make the excuse for why that was a down year and why we can see him bounce back if they get their quarterback situation right. So we can do that. But with Stefon Diggs, it's kind of a weird situation because he's with Josh Allen. There's no quarterback issue here. And it's been 2 years in a row where he has specifically tailed off in the back half of the season, right? We can point to an exact point in time and say, from this point forward, you were in fact dramatically dipping in production. What was the reason for that? Are you cooked? Is it just age? Can you just not make it through a full season anymore? So the first year that this happened was 2022, right? So we can go back. Let's initially go back and look at 2022. Right off the bat, I'm just going to tell you, you got to ignore that. We had a clear and present reason as to why his production dipped dramatically in the back half of the season. Josh Allen got an elbow injury. It was very real. It was a major issue. It didn't just hurt Stefon Diggs. it hurt Josh Allen. The statistics don't lie. Josh Allen hurt his elbow in week 9 in 2022. Weeks 1 through 8, he averaged 28.1 fantasy points per game. Stefon Diggs was on an absolute tear. Like, I was so excited for Stefon Diggs heading into 2023 because of what we saw with Stefon Diggs and Josh Allen when he was healthy in that first half of the season. Over that time period, Diggs was averaging 24.8 points per game. Fantastic, right? Absolutely killing it. There was obviously, I think he was 28 at the time, maybe. Yeah, is my math right on that? Yeah, 28 at the time. So when we're thinking about that, we weren't really worried about age or anything. That wasn't really the factor. We can point directly to that issue with Josh Allen having the elbow injury. And then after the injury, Josh Allen's average in terms of fantasy points per game dropped from that 28.1 all the way down to 21.6. You kind of gloss over it. Like, that's a dramatic dip in production. Like, that's significant. When you go back and you look at it, you don't really see it because overall in averaging out, he was still QB1, right? So it didn't really matter when you're looking at the season as a whole. You didn't really see it unless you dug into it. And even dipping down to 21.6 fantasy points per game, that's not a big deal. That's still fantastic. I mean, it's not Josh Allen's ceiling kind of fantastic, but it's still great. So it wasn't a big glaring issue with him. But when you looked at Stefon Diggs, it stuck out like a sore thumb. He went all the way down to 14.8 fantasy points per game. That's a full 10 fantasy points per game difference in his average, directly tied to the elbow injury. And you have the justification with Josh Allen's production dipping significantly as well. The two were tied together. It wasn't Stefon Diggs having this dramatic dip off in production because he's reached a certain point and he can't finish out a season, right? So we got to ignore 2022. So ignoring 2022, we move on to 2023. And I see some questions in the chat here. As soon as I go through all of this with Stefon Diggs, we'll dive into some of the questions because I'm seeing questions about Curtis Samuel, which is a really good one. Love Curtis Samuel. Questions about Stefon Diggs and his presence in the Houston locker room as a potential cancer in the Houston locker room. So we've got some really good questions here that we will 100% be diving into in a second. But looking at 2023 for Stefon Diggs and for the Bills as a whole, really, and we'll kind of transition into what this means for the Bills moving forward. But, we know the big issue that happened with the Bills in 2023. Mid-season-ish, they fired their offensive coordinator after that Week 10 loss. So when we're looking at the Buffalo Bills and their statistics, what I looked at personally is splitting the season, not in half, but looking at weeks 1 through 10 under Ken Dorsey, and then looking at weeks 11 through 18. And that's how I split up the statistics to really kind of dive in and look at what happened with Josh Allen, what happened with Stefon Diggs, what happened with Gabe Davis too, because Gabe Davis was a factor in there as well. What happened, Dalton Kincaid, Khalil Shakir. We got a question about him in the chat as well. So kind of portioning out the season that way. Weeks 1 through 10, Stefon Diggs was wide receiver 4 overall and wide receiver 7 in average points per game, averaging 20.2. That was a little, it wasn't where he was at the previous season, where he was absolutely on that tear, wide receiver 1 overall when Josh Allen was healthy and everything was perfect. But 20.2 fantasy points per game, that's nothing to take lightly, right? He was performing at the level that we expected. He was fantastic. Statistics were amazing. He had 7 touchdowns. Yardage there was no issue, right? There was no issue with him. But we'll get to what the actual issue was with the Bills in a second. For reference on what that 20.2 means, let's compare him to some of the older receivers as well. Because it's weird to compare. Like, you could say, okay, let's compare him to Michael Pittman. Well, unfortunately, Michael Pittman had adjustments in quarterback situation. You can say, okay, let's compare to Jamar Chase. Again, quarterback situation. So I took 2 guys in the same similar age situation as Stefon Diggs, in the same situation of having a stable quarterback that was playing the entire season, just so we could get kind of like a comparison of what that 20.2 fantasy points per game meant. Tyreek Hill, obviously the top tier example, 24.9 fantasy points per game. Mike Evans, same situation, 17, not point anything, just flat out 17 fantasy points per game. Still fantastic. He had a stellar season. Obviously, there was some ebb and flow there. But when we're looking at him as a whole, it kind of gives you an idea of that 20.2 being very solid for Stefon Diggs. Again, just making that comparison to those guys. So he kind of falls, in that middle in between category where very solid wide receiver, one top 10 wide receiver. You were trusting him. You were feeling good week in and week out with Stefon Diggs on your roster. Now let's look at Gabe Davis, because again, Gabe Davis is also a key point to look at as well when we're looking at evaluating Stefon Diggs last year and the change that he had in the first half of the season versus the back half of the season. So looking at Gabe Davis, Gabe was Gabe Davis. I mean, Gabe, he is what he is, right? he's a streaky boom bust kind of guy. He was averaging 11.2 fantasy points per game. That is what we expect out of out of Gabe Davis. Low receptions, high touchdowns, good yardage. He was exactly who we thought he was, right? That was what we expected out of him. Now, when we look at the back half of the season after they fired Ken Dorsey, weeks 11 through 18, the difference was absolutely insane. Stefon Diggs averaged 10.3 fantasy points per game. His production was legitimately cut in half. Fantasy production was cut in half. The touchdown production, absolutely insane touchdown production. I mentioned he had 7 touchdowns over that first 10 weeks. He had one touchdown after they made the change in offensive coordinator. But again, I mentioned Gabe Davis because we've been staring at Stefon Diggs and saying he had this dramatic dip in production. He cooked. Is this what's the issue with him? What's the problem here? Was it Stefon Diggs? Because Gabe Davis average dipped down to 7.1. That is not what we expect out of Gabe Davis. He is an absolutely streaky receiver. But when you look at him having that dramatic dip in production, Stefon Diggs having that dramatic dip in production, that is not a coincidence. That is not Stefon Diggs being cooked and failing to finish the season. That is a blatant change in offensive philosophy. The problem is that it happened with both Diggs and Davis. And the only game where both Diggs and Gabe Davis actually were both productive, had strong performances, was a game against Philadelphia, who we remember in the back half of 2023, Philadelphia's defense absolutely fell apart and they were getting lit up through the air by anybody and everybody. Actually, they were getting lit up through the air the entire season, but specifically in the back half of the season, it was dreadful. So it makes sense that would be the literal only game where both of those receivers had production. Outside of that, it was really, really bad. I've seen some justification that the issue was, okay, well, Khalil Shakir stepped up. Dalton Kincaid stepped up. And that is factual. Those guys did step up. But the problem here is that they did not step up after Ken Dorsey was fired. They stepped up prior to that. They stepped up when Dawson Knox got injured. The increase in production from Kincaid and Shakir blatantly tied to Dawson Knox. You can literally look at when Knox went out, which off the top of my head, I can't remember. I didn't write down. I think it was like week 8. And you can see the jump in Shakir's snap count because Dawson Knox went out. That meant that the tight end role was primarily filled by Dalton Kincaid. That meant that Khalil Shakir was a massive beneficiary because now he was on the field constantly, playing in the slot constantly. So the ripple effect there and their emergence was Dawson Knox, not the change in offensive coordinator. So their emergence actually had nothing to do with the fact that, literally nothing to do with the fact that, unfortunately, we had that dramatic dip in production for Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis. Very, very interesting. And man, I think I meant to write these statistics down, and now I don't know if I actually wrote them down. Let me double check. Yeah, I did. Actually, I did write this down. Here's the kicker here, and I'm going to show a comment here. Boom, there we go. Yeah, from GJ. Wow, the offensive coordinator did not. Yeah, Josh Allen didn't throw the ball to Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis. Well, and here's the thing, but it worked out for them. And we'll dive into that a little bit more when we talk about, we'll kind of transition here in a second to why this actually worked out well for the Bills. But when you look at the statistics, Josh Allen was actually better and now I realize that I didn't actually write, I wish off the top of my head, Josh Allen's fantasy production weeks 1 through 10 was around 23. It's like a little over 23 fantasy points per game. I think it was right at 23 fantasy points per game. After they made the change in coordinator, Josh Allen's production from a fantasy perspective actually went up. There was no change in his yards per attempt or anything. I'm so mad that I didn't write this down. I think it actually got erased in my show notes here. But it actually is kind of crazy here. Despite the fact that Stefon Diggs' production went down, despite the fact that Gabe Davis's production went down, what did not go down is Josh Allen's production. Very critical there because Josh Allen obviously finds different ways to get it. And the transition really happened is that because I looked through it, I parsed through the information. I was like, okay, well, let's look at yards per attempt. Yards per attempt, there was no change in yards per attempt. And I was like, okay, that's simple, right? Yards per attempt, whatever. Let's look at air yards. Air yards. Nope, air yards was not the issue. The only change that actually happened in terms of Josh Allen's production was his touchdowns. The touchdown rate decreased. We saw a decrease in touchdown rate. We saw, more contributions on the ground from the running backs. And of the touchdowns that remained for the passing touchdowns, we saw a decrease in passing touchdown rate, but we oddly enough saw an increase in passing touchdowns to running backs. Very interesting there. So Josh Allen, his production, oddly enough, really didn't even hurt. Oddly enough. So very interesting there. Very interesting there. But when we're looking at Stefon Diggs and you kind of walk through that, you're kind of realizing that Diggs in his production might not actually been his fault. Am I saying that he is the same Stefon Diggs that he was 2-3 years ago? Not necessarily saying that. But what I am saying here is that the production that he had here in the back half with Buffalo was very much so heavily influenced by what happened at offensive coordinator. So when we're looking at them, let's move off of specifically talking about Stefon Diggs and let's talk about what this means for the Bills and where they are heading, because we've got the mention of the offensive coordinator. We have all of the comments about guys like Curtis Samuel, Khalil Shakir, all of that. And let's look at what this new look Bills team is going to look like, because everyone's talking about the Texans, right? Because it's more interesting to talk about, the Texans and their new super stacked wide receiver core for Stroud, and how CJ Stroud is just the big, massive dynasty winner. And it's just going to be incredible for him. And you're looking at the Bills, and you're like, well, they've let go of their big receivers. Are they hitting a rebuild? Are they resetting? What's happening here? There is going to be a reset here, a slight reset. There's no other way to put it, right? You lose Stefon Diggs, Gabe Davis is gone. You also got rid of key defensive players as well. They're making some changes here. And I don't really blame them for that. They kind of hit a wall. You make that push where you're just so close to the Super Bowl, and you can't get over that hump. So something has to change, right? You have to make some kind of adjustment. And as they kept trying to move forward with that defense, it was getting older. They were getting more injuries year after year after year. They have to shake things up, and they have to make a difference. And we do have a mild reset coming here. But it's really, really critical to look at the 2023 season and why we're not going to panic about Josh Allen, why we're going to look at guys like Dalton Kincaid, Khalil Shakir, and Curtis Samuel and see the value that they have moving forward this 2024 season. Because here's the thing. The Bills were 5-5 when they fired Ken Dorsey the first half of the season. They looked a mess. They did not look like a playoff team. No offense to them, but it just was not working out. Everything that could go wrong was just going wrong, right? Once they made that transition in offensive coordinator, they were fantastic, right? They went on that big run. They beat Kansas City. They beat Dallas. They beat the Dolphins. They just looked so much better. So despite the fact that from a fantasy perspective, we were seeing this dramatic dip in production from these wide receivers that we need. Although we did get our increase in production for James Cook. So thank God for that one. That was fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, Joe Brady. But overall, the team looked better. And Josh Allen, his production from a fantasy standpoint, it went up. Again, he averaged about 25 fantasy points per game after they made the change in offensive coordinator. Even though they were adjusting how they were throwing the ball, where the touchdowns were heading, Josh Allen was still getting his because he's Josh Allen. We had Dalton Kincaid that also showed up Again, the Dawson Knox injury played a major part of that, but it was important to see Kincaid get out on the field and showcase the way that he did. He looked fantastic. He looked the part of what we hope he can be within the Bills offense. We had Khalil Shakir pop as well. He had several big games where he looked like the promising young, oh man, when he was as a rookie, I was so excited for him as a rookie because of the possibility of him filling in that slot role when they, I can't remember if Cole Beasley was gone that year, if that was the year they transitioned or if that was the year he just kind of got phased out. I can't remember specifically, but we had a lot of hope for Khalil Shakir. No, I think Beasley was still there, but didn't really happen. But he popped here in this past season. We got James Cook that was looking strong. But again, Gabe Davis legitimately did not exist in most games. Stefon Diggs was not a factor to the level that he was before. So when we're looking at that, we're saying they're clearly doing a reset, but there's not going to be a massive drop-off because they did well. Josh Allen did well. These other pieces did well while they were not relying on Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis. Diggs is a big loss, right? It's tough to replace a guy like Stefon Diggs, but they're probably not trying to specifically replace Stefon Diggs. They're making adjustments to this offense. And what's going to happen here is that we're going to see them draft a receiver, probably in the first round, right? Now, what is going to be left on the board when they're drafting? That's the big question here. It's a deep receiver, right? It's a deep receiver. And I'm going to show this comment here. The Bills need to trade up for a top 5 wide receiver who can get 1,000 yards in 2024 and hit that rookie draft. They need to make major moves ASAP. They're going to be, I don't want to say guarantee because I hate you say guarantee and then all of a sudden this is the screen recorded screenshot of your fantasy receipt. So I'm not going to say guarantee. But I do think that they will end up drafting a receiver, and it's not the likelihood of them trading up and drafting a guy, one of the top 3 guys, is slim, but I still think it's possible that they can make a move to get a Brian Thomas. That could happen. There are options. Even if they don't get Brian Thomas, there are multiple options here that could fill in well here. But the important thing to note is that we're probably looking at a wide receiver room that is going to feature a rookie receiver who they want to develop into a wide receiver 1, but who may not technically operate as a wide receiver 1 immediately. It just depends on who they're drafting and at what point they get him. Then we're also looking at Curtis Samuel, who obviously has familiarity in the system and somebody who, as much as he did frustrate us at times in Washington, especially for those of us who rostered Terry McLaurin and Jahan Dotson, Curtis Samuel was a frustrating player. Let's not lie about that or beat around the bush. But he was productive, right? Curtis Samuel still has it, and he is a fine wide receiver too, and can be productive within that Bills offense in the context as well. And then you have Khalil Shakir that popped. But here's also the thing that we need to consider here. I would not be shocked if we see both Dalton Kincaid and Dawson Knox on the field at the same time. If you do that, you're not really having to go and make a whole lot of additions and adjustments. You don't need to add multiple receivers because technically speaking, the only receiver that was truly eating in the first half of the season last year was Stefon Diggs, right? We had the run game that was inconsistent. There's so much talent, too many mouths to feed. And I don't really think they need to make an additional 2 receivers. I want to see that 1 rookie receiver drafted in the first round. And then I want to see them rely on Curtis Samuel and Khalil Shakir, but then also have Dalton Kincaid play a major part where he can technically operate as that kind of flex wide receiver 2, wide receiver 1, and at the same time, or wide receiver 2, wide receiver 3. And then at the same time, we can have Dawson Knox filling that more traditional tight end role. That is what I would ideally like to see, right? Oh, thank you. I scrolled down. I realized we had more comments here from Big Noggin. Hadn't noticed the correlation with Dawson Knox. That's why the show is awesome. Thank you. I appreciate that. Because Dawson Knox played a big role in why we didn't get that Dalton Kincaid breakout. And then it had a lot to do with Khalil Shakir finally being able to get on the field more and showcase and garner more targets. But if we don't replace multiple receivers, we can get both Kincaid and Knox on the field at the same time. Not back to that initial tight end role that he had. He restructured his contract a few weeks ago, maybe. Don't quote me on that. So the team is committed to him for an additional year. I don't think we're at risk of not seeing him there in the near future. So if we can get Dawson Knox back to that traditional role, I think taking him like super late in best ball drafts is just kind of like a Hail Mary, because it'd be interesting if we do truly see them do a lot of 2 tight end sets and he goes back to where he was that red zone. He was a red zone target hog for like 1 or 2 seasons there for Josh Allen. So we know the possibility is there. Have Dawson Knox in that traditional tight end role, a good red zone target. Have Khalil Shakir in there with Dalton Kincaid playing slot, Dalton Kincaid is so versatile. There's so much that you can do with him. So if you kind of move him into a more prominent receiving tight end role, you have him out there like a Laporta. Their statistics were very similar when you kind of boil it down. I think the opportunity is there for Dalton Kincaid. And I don't hate what this offense is going to look like. I know it feels ugly and messy when you're looking at the team transitioning to Curtis Samuel and company, but it might not be as messy as we think it's going to be. Certainly not to the point where I've gotten the question, should Josh Allen be moved down in rankings? Because there are people that are legitimately concerned. I'm seeing questions, do we take a guy like CJ Stroud over Josh Allen? CJ Stroud has Josh Allen's main man now. He's got all of these, huge, talented wide receiver targets, potentially 3 top 24 wide receivers, right? Are we going for the volume and the upside of a CJ Stroud and now moving a guy down like Josh Allen? No, we're not. Again, we talked about the average points per game that Josh Allen had last year with the production really dipping down for Stefon Diggs and Gabe Davis. I still think that Josh Allen will essentially be the overall QB1. Again, I won't really be highly concerned over that. They will draft a rookie. Again, he's got the ability to utilize his legs, and that's not going to stop. Every single season they say, we want to get less touches, on the ground for Josh Allen. We want to, take pressure off him. We don't want to use him at the goal line. And it never happens, right? Because you can't control what those guys want to do, right? He's a massive quarterback that wants to be the guy that has it at the goal line. You can't take that out of him. That's what he wants. You can't take it out of him. You can't take it out of Jalen Hurts. It's just, that's what they want to do. So I'm not concerned about Josh Allen. I like the prospects of the value that you're going to get here for his pass catchers as well. The only one who's obviously being moved up significantly is Dalton Kincaid, but I think he'll be worth it. I'm willing to take him at a potential ADP of, I've seen some people potentially moving him up to tight end 5. I'm not going to lie, I have not updated my rankings. It has been that kind of a month in March, but I've seen a lot of people moving Dalton Kincaid up to potential like even as high as a tight end 5. I don't think he'll go higher than that, but I think he's very reasonable at where he is projected to go. So when I'm looking at this overall offense and the potential value that we can get out of it, I don't hate it. You want assets tied to Josh Allen, and you're going to be getting them at significant discounts. There's some good potential value here. So I don't mind it at all. Now we're going to move on. And actually, let me go back and make sure that did I touch on all of the questions here? I did a little bit, but yeah. Does Curtis Samuel take over in Buffalo as well? I feel very confident in him as a solid high-end wide receiver 3 in terms of fantasy production. He'll operate as the wide receiver 2 in that offense. They'll have high-end wide receiver 3 kind of production in that offense. I don't mind it at all. I think they'll probably be very open to utilizing him occasionally on the ground as well. So when I'm looking at Curtis Samuel, you're looking at a fine value play as well. Same thing for Khalil Shakir, him getting on the field. I loved the pop that we saw out of him as well. So there's a lot of potential here. Going to move on to talk about the Houston Texans. This is like the happy time period where we're talking about what are we glazing the Houston Texans essentially. But before I dive into the Texans and how this affects their offense, because while this is fantastic for the Houston Texans as a whole in terms of them being Super Bowl contenders, right? It's not so wonderful from us, from a fantasy perspective, when we're talking about the wide receiver, the pass catchers in this offense, and even how it can potentially affect Joe Mixon as well. So let's dive into all of that after we take this short break. And here, a super quick word from our sponsor.
This episode is brought to you by Player Profiler, the Dynasty Deluxe package. The rankings are the best in the industry. It includes strategy mode where you can say, hey, change the rankings to be win now. Oh, change the rankings to be productive struggle. There's also a draft planner to help to strategize where you should take players because the draft planner also includes ADP. There's a trade finder where we look up on My Fantasy League and we see trades that are done, including a particular player. Then there's a trade analyzer where you can plug in draft picks, players, and we assign a lifetime value to draft picks out 5 years. The best thing about our trade analyzer, it can't be gamed with volume. And there's mock draft data to see right now what's the market for player X versus player Y, including in the fall when very few mock drafts are happening. And our Dynasty guide, the Dynasty Dominator, would cost you $10 on Amazon, but you get it for free with Dynasty Deluxe, and you get our rookie guide for free, a $25 value. So you get all of that for $45. I mean, it's a great deal.
It is a great deal, by the way. It is never too early to start investing in the tools you need for 2024 because if you're like me, you've already dove into. You're making your dynasty trades. You're doing your best ball drafts. And can I say there's nothing more fun than doing best ball drafts pre-draft? I know it's like painful in terms of the conjecture. I drafted one team where I did a zero RB build, and oh man, it was like painful once I got to trying to decide. I've invested in rookie running backs and I'm, sitting here and I'm like, okay, I'm taking shots. I'm basically trying to shoot for figuring out who is going to be drafted to Dallas because that is that is the one that you want to have in best ball. But yeah, I just love drafting prior to the actual draft because I feel like you can get such good value on all of those rookie assets. They're going to pop. You grab your Puka Nacua, you grab your Tank Dell, had lots of Tank Dell last year. So nothing better than a pre-draft best ball draft. But diving into Houston Texans and how this affects them. Obviously, from a real football perspective, it's fantastic, right? instant Super Bowl as if they weren't already potential Super Bowl contenders. But good Lord, incredible. We've already got our first question here about the Texans. We've got curious as to what it does from Big Noggin, curious as to what it does to Nico's future in Houston, and then mentioning Collins. Will they just replace him after this year as well? Now, the key here is we got some news here around Stefon Diggs a few hours ago, maybe, or something like that, that basically they adjusted Stefon Diggs. This was pretty slick. They adjusted Stefon Diggs contract. So he's a free agent next year. There's no long-term commitment here. So it's very much so win now. Minimal risk because you're not massively tied into him and this huge contract for the future, although money is not really an issue for the Texans. But it was interesting that they did that because I think that kind of signals to us that I don't think that Nico's future in Houston is going to be a massive concern. I don't think we have to worry about that. Again, we consider Stefon's age. We consider the fact that it is no longer a huge multi-year commitment, because that was everyone's concern before and why they thought he wasn't tradable, because there was this long-term commitment for him. And so now we don't have to worry about that. So I'm not super worried about Nico Collins and his role with Houston. Nico Collins was one of my favorite players last year as a potential third-year breakout, because you could excuse why those first 2 years were what they were, right? I love looking at young receivers like a Drake London. That's not even, I mean, that's super obvious, right? But you love looking at those guys that have been in the year or in the league for a couple of years, and they've been struggling with poor quarterback plays, and they're finally going to get that massive upgrade, and you finally get to see exactly what they can do when they have someone who can actually get them the ball, right? So I was not surprised to see Nico do what he did, and I think his future and his talent is so promising. So love Nico Collins. But when we are looking at the Texans here, love the fact that they are not messing around. They clearly made a massive, insane leap in 2023 to go from where they were legitimately, theoretically, almost the worst team in the NFL and to going to a true playoff contender. And that was without Tank Dell. Can you imagine if Tank Dell had not gotten injured and remained and, the team was complete as a whole? You could have potentially seen them move even further deeper into the playoffs. So when we are looking at what they're bringing to the table this year, it is incredible. Shout out to Lovie Smith. I always like to give Lovie Smith a shout out for the role that he played in the Texans. I mean, Chicago should, everybody involved in the Texans getting that second overall pick should really just erect a statue in Lovie's honor, because him and Davis Mills too. Give Davis Mills his credit as well for the luckiest pass ever that literally set Houston up for absolute greatness. So yeah, Lovie did Houston right. Fantastic. Yeah, because this is they're so set for the future. It is not even funny. The Texans are not taking a slow approach with this, and it kind of makes sense because remember, because of the trade to because of the trade up to take Will Anderson with the third pick, they don't have that 2024 first, right? That was involved in that trade for Will Anderson, which is ironic because that was also a controversial move. I mean, I remember people just really thought that Houston was just making all kinds of stupid decisions. Joke's on them, right? But they really, I mean, you literally end up with the best rookie offensive player, the best rookie defensive player. Just an embarrassment of riches. They made the right choice there. So now they're grabbing up veterans to push them over this hump. Because despite the fact that CJ Stroud is just a second-year quarterback heading into the season, he has the capabilities to really make a true push for the Super Bowl. We see that out of him if they can really just, shore up that defense, which obviously is a specialty of D'Amico's. And again, make some adjustments to that offensive line. Maybe they utilize the draft for that. And then we've got the wide receiver core that is absolutely stacked now. They went out going out and getting Joe Mixon. Say what you want about Joe Mixon. And I will say that I am on the I'm not a Joe Mixon hater, but I am someone that kind of looks at the statistics and I'm like, I worry. I continually worry about the potential fall off, but I don't think we have to make a major worry about that because he is the RB1 in Houston. He's not going to get competition for Dameon Pierce, unfortunately. Sorry, Dameon Pierce. I feel so bad for you. Maybe Houston will free you and you can go find a scheme that fits you. But unfortunately, I don't think that's happening. So we've got Joe Mixon here that is now in a high-flying offense, which is what he thrives in, right? Because he needs to be in a system where he is the RB1. He gets the volume. He gets the goal line touches. He's not competing with a rushing quarterback. He's, and CJ Stroud's obviously mobile, but we're talking about you're not competing with the Josh Allen, right? So this is literally the perfect situation, a strong situation for Joe Mixon. And just everyone overall is just, this team as a whole is just being placed on another level. Now, when we are talking about the Texans and what this is going to do to their receiving core, therein lies the issue of us from a fantasy perspective, because we already talked about Stefon Diggs. We went through all the statistics, and while we don't know for sure, I'm not 100% saying that Stefon Diggs could not be at the point where, he's, of a certain age and things start to, drop off a little bit for him and whatnot. But we talked about the statistics with the Bills for the past 2 seasons and why statistically Stefon Diggs isn't actually dropping off, right? So we know that there is the possibility that he can get into this offense with the Houston Texans and he can thrive. And that creates a problem for us when we're looking at the fact that we were drafting top 20 receivers in both Nico Collins and Tank Dell. And now we have to account for Stefon Diggs, assuming that he didn't hit a wall here. Things are going to get a little bit messy. Personally, while I did have Diggs ranked higher, technically speaking, well, just like a tiny bit, I really didn't prefer to draft him. I prefer Nico Collins or Tank Dell just because of the upside that they offer. And that's not going to change in this trade. I still prefer the wide receiver that I would be taking first, who is the first Texans wide receiver that I would be taking off the board. It is Nico Collins here. And then it would be followed by Tank Dell, and then it would be followed by Stefon Diggs. And the reason for this isn't really a knock towards Stefon Diggs. It's just that when I look at this Texans offense and why we need to kind of hold our horses before we make a final judgment on what this offense is going to look like, how we view these receivers, how we rank these receivers, and the fantasy production that we expect out of these receivers is going to be heavily related to where they line up on the field. These are three major receivers that all play on the outside. There's only so many receivers you can have on the outside consistently, right? So how are all of these guys going to fit into this offense? Well, some people's instinct might be to say Tank Dell is small, he'll play slot. I don't think that's going to happen. Oddly enough, between Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Stefon Diggs on their respective teams last year, the one who played out of the slot the most was Stefon Diggs. I think that's what we're going to see here. Stefon Diggs is going to be the guy that fills the slot role because last season it was Robert Woods. Tank Dell was on the outside. Nico Collins was on the outside. Remember? And then Robert Woods and Noah Brown as well. We're primarily playing in the slot. I think what we'll see is obviously, we'll see Stefon Diggs step into and perform at a much better level than what Robert Woods had last season, because obviously Robert Woods, not the Robert Woods that he was of yesteryear, but Stefon Diggs in that role could be highly productive. So when I look at him, I actually think that Diggs will be the most consistent option, especially in PPR. He could be the wide receiver that's targeted the most. He could have the most receptions. And I think that if you're looking at the guy and you don't want to take the risk and you're saying who's the one who's going to have on a week in and week out basis, the guy that I feel more comfortable slotting in, probably going to be Stefon Diggs if he is the one playing in the slot. I think he could be the target leader, and that's awesome for PPR, but at the same time, I want to go with the high ceiling, the high upside players, especially if all their ADPs are moving backwards, which is what's going to happen. The ADP for Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Stefon Diggs, they're all going to drop, right? All of them are going to drop, and we're going to be getting this discount on these big, explosive wide receivers, especially in Nico Collins and Tank Dell, who will likely be playing the primary outside roles. So I still prefer to go that direction because when I'm looking at these guys that I no longer have to rely on as a wide receiver one, none of these guys we are drafting as a wide receiver one. That's the beauty of it now, because now everything is muddied and it's going to be too many mouths to feed. No one is going to be drafting any three of these receivers as the wide receiver one on their team. So the beauty in that is that, okay, if it's a wide receiver two and I've got a stable wide receiver one, let's say first round I take Amon-Ra St. Brown. Okay, well then I can take the risk and say, I know I can rely on Amon-Ra. I'll take that risk and I will draft Nico Collins. I'll draft Tank Dell because I want that high upside option and I have a stable wide receiver one and I can do that with my wide receiver two. So that's kind of how I'm looking at this team as a whole. It's going to be interesting, right? It's going to be interesting to see how it shakes out. But provided that we get to training camp and we get the rumors in the news that we're going to be seeing a lot of Stefon Diggs playing in the slot, that's how I feel comfortable with it and thinking, okay, we're going to see the consistency from Stefon Diggs, but the high upside from the other guys, the touchdown opportunities from the other guys. So we might see less touchdowns from Diggs, more receptions, and then the big plays and touchdowns from our guys, our explosive players on the outside. So that's kind of how I see the situation shaking out. Particularly because their ADPs are going to be dropping back, I don't hate any of them. Right? I'm willing to take a stab on all three of them, even Stefon Diggs, especially if his ADP is dropping the most as well, because people are concerned about the potential drop off in him maybe being the wide receiver three in that offense. We're getting a nice little discount on these guys that we were having to draft pretty early before. So I don't mind this at all. You want any asset tied to CJ Stroud. The big obvious one here, the big loser is poor Dalton Schultz. or God, I've got like Dalton Kincaid on my mind. Schultz is definitely going to be the big loser in this, unfortunately. The problem here is that he is neither going to have consistency in touchdowns or high volume in targets. And so there's really no saving grace. I mean, the good news is that his ADP wasn't particularly high. It was never going to be particularly high. But now you're looking at all kinds of different options and saying, this is not a guy who I think has a ton of upside in this offense, especially when you consider that we still got Joe Mixon on the ground as well. There's just not going to be a ton of touchdown opportunities here. So I don't hate this situation, oddly enough, for Nico Collins, Tank Dell, and Stefon Diggs. I don't hate it because we are going to get a discount on them, and I'm willing to take the upside of all of them. The only person I do hate it for, unfortunately, is Schultz. So that is really the big thing here. But the good news is here for Houston, this reminds me a lot of when LA traded for Odell Beckham Jr. Now, granted, that was midseason, but it reminds me a lot of that in terms of the Texans going out and getting this veteran receiver to add to a strong receiving core already, just to shore up and push them to that Super Bowl level. So, I don't know. It's going to be a fun year. It's going to be a fun year for sure. I'm going to jump back to the comments here because we've got some questions. Shout out to Brittany here. She's in a best ball draft with Noggin, doing the exact same thing, drafting all the rookie running backs that you think might go to Dallas. Right? It's like, hey, it's best ball. That's the strategy we're looking for, right? You want to draft those rookie receivers or the rookie running and the receivers, but the rookie running backs are what you're getting the value on here. One of these boys is going to end up in a good situation. We don't know which one yet. We know who's visiting Dallas, which is obviously the top three. If we could only figure out which one of them is going to be the starter here. And shout out to Lovey. And then from It's Hazel, do I like the Dolphins this season? I always like the Dolphins, right? Because they have players that I absolutely love. Good Lord. I love Tyreek Hill. I love Jalen Waddle, even though consistency is the thing for him, unfortunately. That has always been the struggle. And I don't mind the running back situation here. When I look at the Dolphins, obviously, Tua is interesting because Tua was exposed in terms of his fantasy production, right? We know we can predict when Tua is going to do good. If it's a good weather game, if it's a good defensive matchup, we are getting 4 touchdowns from Tua. Thank you, Tua. If it's a tough defensive matchup, if he's going to the cold, and I feel him on that because I'm not performing in the cold, right? I'm a Southern girl. But we know that we can predict when Tua is going to have a struggle bus game, right? But the good news is that now that we know that, Tua's ADP is, further back, not the worst QB2 to draft if you're kind of waiting later. Maybe you want to take him and take a chance on one of these rookie quarterbacks. We'll be finding out soon exactly who's going to be where, but we've got a couple of options there that we could pair up with a guy like Tua. But when I'm looking at that offense, I like everyone in it. The only one that I'm honestly kind of mildly concerned about is Devon Achane, and I'm not concerned about him and his talent. I'm concerned about the ADP. The ADP concerns me. It's terrifying to draft a guy as high as he is going and will go, and he potentially might not be the RB1 on his team. Because, again, we talked about old players, right? When we look at Raheem Mostert, we don't see a drop-off in Raheem Mostert. Visually, when you look at him, you don't say there's anything about it. He's older, obviously, but he did start a little bit later in terms of the volume that he was seeing, started later in his career. So not a ton of mileage on him. Visually, you don't see any major drop-off here. He made it through the entire season last year. Yay, Raheem Mostert. So yeah, it's mildly terrifying drafting Devon Achane where he is. And unfortunately, you're not entirely sure about the portion that he will have in his own backfield. That's scary to me, particularly when you have so many other options in a similar ADP range that we know they're the RB1 of their team. Like, it's terrifying to draft a Devon Achane, when you know for sure that a Josh Jacobs is the RB1 on a team that is, highly productive on offense as well. So that's the only concern. You get a lot of good value with Raheem Mostert as well. You're getting that continued dip in his ADP, so he's a nice little value play there. So overall, I love the Dolphins. Tyreek, grab him if you can. Obviously, Jalen Waddle is Jalen Waddle, fine wide receiver too. And his ADP has finally dropped. We're no longer having to draft him at the point at which we were before, when he was just going ridiculously too high. So yeah, I think that wraps everything up in terms of the questions that we got here. I appreciate everyone joining in. Fantastic show, very active chat. Love to see the audience here. Again, yeah, mailbag show as well. So if you ever have any questions, you can tag me on Twitter and let me know if you want me to include your show or your question on the show. I will absolutely do that. And if you don't want to include it as well, hey, just hit me up and ask me a question. If you tag me, I always do my best to respond. And if I don't, you can always tag me twice. I don't ever get offended. You say, hey, Tera. I'm like, okay, hey. Sometimes Twitter escapes me, right? If you're listening on the podcast version, please subscribe. That would be greatly appreciated. If you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like the video, drop me a comment below as well, and make sure that you're subscribed to Player Profiler. And you can also subscribe to my YouTube channel as well at It's Tera Time, ITSTERATIME. Other than that, appreciate you joining in. Thank you, everybody. We are so close to the draft. Good Lord, I'm getting excited. We're so close to the draft. We will be having some draft content coming up soon, and then we'll be absolutely insane post-draft because there will be about 5,000 things to talk about. This is going to be such an exciting draft. I'm so excited. Okay, that is it. Thank you all for tuning in. I will catch you again next time.